Maya's heart raced as she stood beside her car. Her hands trembling, the late afternoon sun beat down on the quiet, deserted road she had been driving along just moments before. Now everything felt eerily still, as if the world had stopped moving the moment Officer Jenkins' squad car pulled up behind her. The flashing blue lights reflected off her rearview mirror, filling her with dread. This wasn't supposed to happen. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, gently cradling the small bump that had grown over the past few months. She was 5 months pregnant, and every decision she made now was not just for her. It was for her unborn child. Maya's breath was shallow as she turned to face the officer, her mind running through everything she had been taught about staying calm during a police encounter. Be polite, be cooperative. Don't make sudden movements. But as Officer Jenkins' approached, there was something off in his demeanor. His eyes were cold, his jaw clenched, and his hand hovered over the holster on his hip. From the moment he stepped out of his car, there was an unmistakable hostility radiating from him. Maya could feel it, that tension in the air, the kind that warned her something was about to go very wrong. License and registration? Jenkins barked, his voice devoid of any warmth or professionalism. Maya fumbled nervously, quickly reaching into her purse to retrieve the documents. She made sure her movements were slow and deliberate, aware of how easily things could escalate. Her fingers shook as she handed him the papers. I wasn't speeding," Maya stammered, trying to make sense of why she had been pulled over. She had been driving well below the speed limit, her mind focused on the baby, on the quiet life growing inside her. There had to be some mistake. Jenkins barely glanced at her registration before his eyes locked onto her, glaring with an intensity that made Maya's skin crawl. "Step out of the vehicle." He ordered, his tone harsh and commanding. Maya froze, her heart skipping a beat. Step out of the vehicle. Why she had done everything right, there was no reason for her to get out of the car. She wasn't a threat. I'm pregnant," she said softly, placing her hand on her stomach again, as if to remind him to humanize herself in his eyes. But Jenkins didn't seem to care. "I said, get out of the car," Jenkins shouted. Taking a step closer, his hand moved to his belt, resting on the bat and hanging from his waist. There was no compassion in his eyes, no understanding, just pure cold authority. Maya's pulse quickened, her mind raised. What was happening? Why was he being so aggressive? She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to panic. The first 10 seconds of this encounter were already going downhill, and she knew that any sudden move could make it worse. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm, to keep her voice steady. "Please," Maya pleaded. "I don't understand. Why are you asking me to step out of the car?" "I haven't done anything wrong." Jenkins' face hardened, his lip curling in contempt. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he spat. "Step out of the car or I'll make you get out." His voice was like ice, sending a chill down Maya's spine. Fear gripped her as she realized this wasn't just a routine stop. This was personal. The way he was looking at her, it wasn't about the law. It was about power. She was a black woman alone on a quiet road, and this officer had made up his mind before he even asked for her license. He wasn't interested in explanations. He wasn't interested in her at all, except a reminder of who was in control. The weight of her vulnerability hit her like a tidal wave. The fact that she was pregnant, that she was carrying a life inside her, didn't seem to matter to him. She wasn't a person to him, she was a target. And that terrified her more than anything. Reluctantly, Maya reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling as she pushed the door open and stepped out of the car. Her legs felt weak, but she stood as tall as she could, her hand never leaving her belly. "Stay calm. Maya, don't give him a reason to hurt you." The moment she was out of the car, Jenkins moved closer, his imposing figure looming over her. Maya instinctively took a step back, but he followed, closing the gap between them. His eyes were filled with disdain. His lips twisted into a sneer as he looked her up and down. "What are you hiding?" Jenkins growled, his hand still resting dangerously close to his weapon. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. What was he talking about? She wasn't hiding anything. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, her voice shaking. I'm just trying to go home." But Jenkins wasn't listening. His mind was made up to him. She was guilty of something, anything, and he was going to make sure she paid for it. He moved even closer, his voice low and menacing. Don't lie to me, I know your type. You people think you can get away with anything, don't you? Maya's eyes widened in shock. You a type? The words hit her, like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about her being pulled over. This was about the color of her skin. He saw her as less than human, and that realization sent a wave of nausea through her. I'm not doing anything wrong, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She wanted to run to get away from this man who saw her as nothing more than a stereotype. But she was frozen in place. The weight of fear, of helplessness, kept her rooted to the spot. Jenkins took another step forward, his face inches from hers. Now you think being pregnant is going to get you out of this, he sneered. You think I care about your little sob story? Maya's breath caught in her throat. The cold cruelty in his voice was like nothing she had ever heard before. She had always known racism existed, but she had never been confronted with it like this. So blatant, so raw. It was terrifying. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Don't cry, don't show weakness. He'll only use it against you. I'm just trying to go home, Maya repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Now she was pleading not for mercy, but for humanity, for this man to see her as a person, as someone deserving of respect, of dignity. But Jenkins only laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent chills down her spine. You're not going anywhere, he said, his hand moving to his, baton fingers gripping it tightly. Get on the ground now. Maya's heart dropped on the ground. She looked down at her swollen belly, then back at him in disbelief. I can't, she stammered. I'm pregnant, please, I said. Get on the ground. Jenkins roared, his patience gone. The anger in his voice was palpable, a boiling rage that threatened to spill over at any moment. He was done playing games. He wanted her down, and he didn't care what it took to get her there. Maya's legs trembled as she tried to process what was happening. This can't be real. This can't be happening. But it was, and she was alone. She could see the road stretching out behind them, empty and deserted. There was no one around to help, no one to witness what was about to happen. Her mind screamed for her to run to get away from this man who clearly had no regard for her safety, but she couldn't. Where would she go? The first 10 seconds of this encounter had been terrifying, but now with Jenkins standing over her, demanding she get on the ground, those 10 seconds felt like a ticking clock, counting down to something far worse. Maya stood frozen, her eyes locked on Jenkins as his grip on his bat and tightened. She had no choice. She had to comply. But as she moved to kneel, a sudden pain shot through her stomach, a sharp, overwhelming cramp that left her gasping for air. She clutched her belly, panic rising as the pain intensified the baby. Something was wrong. Jenkins watched her with cold eyes, unmoved by her obvious distress. I said, get on the ground. He repeated, his voice hard as steel, but Maya couldn't. She could barely breathe. The pain was too much. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, desperately dialing the only number she could think of as the line rang. She prayed someone had to help her. Maya's heart raced as she stood by the side of the road, one hand protectively placed on her swollen belly. The blinding red and blue lights from Officer Jenkins' squad car cast ominous shadows around them, but all she could focus on was the growing fear in her chest. Her pulse quickened as the officer approached his face, twisted with hostility. Why had he stopped her? She hadn't done anything wrong, yet the situation was already spiraling out of control. Officer Jenkins was towering over her now, his hand resting on his holster as if she were some kind of threat. He wasn't interested in what she had to say, dismissing her explanations with a scoff. His voice was sharp, filled with condescension, as he barked orders did on the ground. Now Maya's breath hitched in her throat. Officer, please, I'm pregnant, she said, trying to stay calm despite the rising panic. She gestured to her obvious baby bump, hoping he'd understand that forcing her to the ground wasn't just unnecessary, it was dangerous. Surely he wouldn't, but Jenkins' face darkened further, his eyes narrowing as if her words were some kind of challenge to his authority. He didn't care about her pregnancy, her safety, or her explanations. He had already decided that she was guilty of something, anything, and her attempts to reason with him only made him angrier. I said, get on the ground, he shouted, his hand now gripping her arm tightly. Maya gasped, stumbling slightly as Jenkins yanked her toward the pavement. Pain shot through her abdomen, and she instinctively clutched her stomach, her mind flashing with fear for her unborn baby. The terror in her eyes was unmistakable now, but Jenkins didn't notice or didn't care. The situation was escalating, and it felt like it was happening in slow motion, every second dragging out into a nightmare. A small crowd had started to gather, at a distance passers-by, who had seen the flashing lights and heard the shouting. Some of them pulled out their phones recording the scene as they watched with growing concern a black woman visibly pregnant being manhandled by a white police officer. It wasn't right, but no one stepped forward to intervene just yet. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and no one wanted to get involved in something that could turn ugly. Maya's mind raced, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mix of fear and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. She was just driving home from work, trying to get through the last few weeks of her pregnancy without any stress, and now she was on the verge of being thrown to the ground by a man who was supposed to protect her. She whined as Jenkins twisted her arm behind her back, pushing her closer to the ground. Her knees buckled slightly under the pressure, and she cried out in pain, "Please, you hurting me!" She pleaded, her voice cracking as she fought to stay upright to protect her baby from the force of the fall. But Jenkins didn't stop. His grip tightened, his expression hardening with every second that passed. "Stop resisting," he snarled, as if he was convinced that she was some kind of criminal, someone who deserved to be subdued, but Maya wasn't. Resisting, she was just trying to keep herself and her baby safe. The fear in her voice was evident, but it only seemed to fuel Jenkins' aggression. The crowd murmured in confusion and disbelief, some stepping closer to get a better view of what was happening. A few voices called out, "She's pregnant," but Jenkins either didn't hear or didn't care. His mind was already made up. He was the authority, and May was just another suspect, another black person to be controlled. Suddenly, without warning, Jenkins pushed harder, forcing Maya down onto her knees. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her body, and she gasped for air, clutching her stomach protectively. "Please," she whimpered, tears stinging her eyes as she tried to catch her breath. "Please stop." Her voice was drowned out by Jenkins' shouts. "Get down! Stop resisting!" His hand pressed on her back, trying to force her all the way down to the ground. But Maya's body was fighting back, not against him, but against the unnatural position, against the weight of fear and physical pain that was threatening to overwhelm her. The onlookers had grown more vocal now, their concern turning into anger as they watched the brutality unfold in front of them. "She's not resisting. She's pregnant. Man, what's wrong with you?" One person shouted, their phone held high, capturing every second of the horrifying scene. Jenkins shot a quick glance at the growing crowd, but it didn't stop him. If anything, it seemed to spur him on, like he was proving something to himself or to them. He was in control here. No one could challenge him. Not this black woman, not the bystanders. No one. He turned his attention back to Maya, who was trembling, trying to stay on her knees, despite the intense pain in her lower back and stomach. Maya's thoughts were consumed with one thing. Her baby, was it okay? Could this stress, this violence harm her unborn child? She had to protect it, had to survive this moment. But how could she, when the very person who was supposed to protect her was attacking her? I can't breathe," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the strain. The pressure from Jenkins' hand was crushing her, and every breath felt like a battle. But Jenkins didn't ease up. In fact, he seemed to press down harder, as if he couldn't hear her, or worse, didn't believe her. More people were stepping forward now, emboldened by the sight of the brutality. Several were shouting, trying to get Jenkins' attention, trying to make him see the reality of the situation. "Let her go. She didn't do anything," one man yelled, his voice shaking with anger. But Jenkins remained deaf to the growing protests around him. He was too far gone, too wrapped up in his own sense of authority to realize the damage he was doing to him. This was just another day, another suspect, another arrest. The fact that Maya was a pregnant black woman didn't matter to him. Her humanity didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was in control. Maya's vision was starting to blur. Now her body struggling to cope with the pain and fear. She couldn't understand how it had come to this. Why was this happening to her? She had always done everything right. She worked hard, lived a quiet life, and now all of that was crumbling in front of her because of one man's blind rage. Suddenly a voice rang out louder than the others' call for help. Someone shouted, and in the next moment, several people had their phones out. Not just recording, but dialing 911, reporting the very officer who was supposed to be protecting them. Jenkins hesitated for the first time, his eyes flicking to the crowd that had now gathered around him. The tension in the air had shifted. He could feel the weight of their stares, their judgment for a brief moment. His grip on Maya loosened, and she gasped for breath, her body sagging with relief, but it wasn't over. Jenkins, still caught up in his power trip, straight. Ed up, glaring at the crowd, back off. He barked, waving his free hand toward them. This is police business. She's under arrest. The crowd wasn't buying it. They had seen enough, and their phones were still recording, documenting every second of Jenkins' assault on a defenseless pregnant woman. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. As the minutes dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't going to end the way Jenkins expected. The weight of the crowd's disapproval, the undeniable evidence in their hands, and the growing unrest were starting to shift the tide. He wasn't in control anymore, and Maya, still gasping for air, knew that help had to come soon, because if it didn't, she wasn't sure how much more her body could take. Maya on the cold, rough pavement, her body trembling as her hand instinctively clutched her swollen belly. Fear surged through her like electricity. But it wasn't just for herself, her baby. The tiny life inside her that had kicked and squirmed just moments before was now eerily still. Her mind raced with panic as Officer Jenkins stood above her, barking commands, his voice filled with the venom of authority, gone unchecked the first 10 seconds of this moment. Stretched into an eternity, every breath felt like a struggle. Each heartbeat a reminder of the danger she was in. The pain from the fall spread through her abdomen. Sharp and terrifying, Jenkins' face was a mask of rage, his eyes void of any empathy or awareness of the situation's gravity. He had decided from the moment he saw her. What kind of person she was: not worthy of humanity, not worthy of protection, just another criminal to subdue. Maya's phone, lying just inches away, buzzed faintly. She had to reach it with her free hand. She dragged herself across the pavement, her fingers scraping against the ground as she stretched for the phone. She could feel the tension in the air, the crowd behind her growing larger, their murmur growing louder. Some were recording, others were shouting in protest, but none dared to intervene physically. They knew the risks. "Stay down," I said, "stay down," Jenkins shouted again, his grip tightening on the baton. He held his knuckles white, his voice cut through the noise filled with self-righteous fury. But Maya couldn't afford to stay down. She managed to grasp the phone, her fingers trembling as she fumbled to unlock it. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear for her baby's safety mixing with the growing certainty that this could spiral out of control. She couldn't let this continue. Not like this. Her thumb found the number she needed almost instinctively. The number she had memorized since she was a child. Her father, he would know what to do. The first ring seemed to echo in her ears, each second dragging on painfully. Would he pick up in time? Would he understand the urgency of what was happening? Another sharp pain ripped through her belly, and she gasped, trying to stay focused. She had to stay focused. The crowd continued to shout, and some even screamed at the officer to stop. But none of their voices broke through Jenkins' tunnel vision. He was in control. Or so he thought then. On the third ring, a deep, familiar voice answered Maya. "What's wrong?" Her father's voice was steady, but Maya knew he could sense something was off. He was always attuned to her, always protective, especially now with the baby on the way. But there was an edge in his voice this time, a quiet intensity that made her feel for just a moment like she might be safe. "Dad," Maya's voice cracked, her throat tight with fear. How could she explain what was happening? The words felt tangled in her chest, but she forced them out in shaky breaths. "I'm on the ground, an officer, I need help. I'm scared." There was a pause on the other end, and Maya knew her father was processing. Chief Wilson wasn't just any father. He was a man of power, a man who had risen through the ranks to become one of the most respected police chiefs in the state. He understood the weight of her words more than anyone else could. "Maya," he said, his voice dropping low, the calm before the storm, Where are you? Tell me exactly where you are? Maya's hands shook as she tried to speak, her breaths coming in. Shallow gasps, Jenkins was still standing over her, his voice a constant background hum, but she barely registered what he was saying anymore. Her mind was solely focused on her father's voice, her only lifeline in this moment. I'm by the freeway, she managed to whisper, near exit 22. He's not listening, Dad. Her voice cracked again, but this time with emotion. She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Her father already understood on the other end of the line. Chief Wilson's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen this scenario play out too many times on the news and reports, and even in cases he had handled himself. But this was different this time. It was his daughter asterisk, his pregnant daughter asterisk on the ground, under the boot of a man who had no idea what kind of storm he was inviting into his life. Listen to me. Maya Wilson said, his voice sharp but soothing. Help is coming. Stay as calm as you can. I need you to breathe. Okay, just breathe and hold on. I'm going to be there. You hear me? I'm coming. Maya nodded even though he couldn't see her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them back. She had to stay strong for herself, for her baby, for the family she was trying to protect. She squeezed her phone tighter, holding onto his voice like a lifeline. Meanwhile, Jenkins was still looming, his frustration growing as he noticed Maya on the phone. Who are you calling? He barked, taking a step toward her. His face twisted with suspicion, as if the simple act of reaching out for help was to him another form of defiance. I said, put that phone down. But Maya didn't respond. She couldn't respond. She had to keep her father on the line. He was her only hope. I told you I'm sending backup right now, Chief Wilson said on the phone. And I'll be there too. Stay on the line with me. Just keep talking. Jenkins' eyes narrowed as he saw the determination in Maya's face. And for a brief second, doubt flickered across his features, but he quickly pushed it. Aside, this was his scene. He was in control, or at least that's what he told himself. He couldn't lose face in front of the crowd. Not now. Maya tried to shift her position. The pain in her abdomen worsening as she moved, the fear for her baby noted her, but she kept her breathing as steady as possible, focusing on her father's words. Her father had always told her how important it was to stay calm in moments of crisis, to think clearly when everything around you was falling apart. But this was different. This was personal. As she lay there, the first hooks of doubt crept into her mind. Would her father's influence, his status as police chief, be enough? Would it reach her in time before Jenkins pushed things even further? Jenkins moved closer, standing over her. Once again, his shadow stretching over her body. The crowd was getting louder now, their cries and shouts of, leave her alone. And she's pregnant, ringing in her ears. But still, no one intervened. They knew better than to physically step in. It could make things worse. Suddenly, a woman's voice from the crowd pierced through the noise. She didn't do anything, the woman shouted, her voice filled with righteous anger. She's pregnant, for God's sake. Jenkins turned his head, glaring at the source of the voice, but the crowd's energy was shifting. The cameras were on him now. Too many eyes were watching. He hesitated for the first time, uncertain of his next move. The power he wielded was now being tested by the very people he sought to control. Maya felt a flicker of hope as she sensed the crowd's change. Maybe things were shifting in her favor. Maybe Jenkins would finally back down. Maybe he'd realize the mistake he was making. Maybe he would listen. But the officer's grip tightened on his baton and his jaw clenched. He wasn't ready to give up control. Her father's voice came through the phone again, steadier but urgent. Now, Maya, I'm close. I'm 5 minutes away. You stay with me. Don't hang up. Maya ended, swallowing hard as the minutes dragged on. She just had to hold on for 5 more minutes. Just 5 more minutes. Could she survive 5 more minutes? Her mind raced, but in the midst of the chaos, she held on to one thing: her father was coming. And when he arrived, everything would change. The sound of approaching sirens pierced the tense air, flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of nearby buildings. Officer Jenkins stood tall, his backpack straightening as 2 more squad cars pulled up to the scene. Backup had arrived, and in his mind that meant he was in the clear. Maya, still lying on the ground, one hand protectively covering her stomach, felt a surge of panic. Would they make things worse? Her body ached from the harsh treatment, her mind racing with fear for her baby. The gathering crowd had grown larger, and the phones recording the incident had multiplied. Jenkins gave them a fleeting glance, but showed no sign of concern. He didn't care about the cameras in his mind. He was just doing his job as far as he was concerned. Maya was just another problem that needed to be dealt with, and his colleagues would back him up just like they always did. The other officers stepped out of their car, slowly taking in the scene before them. Maya, a visibly pregnant black woman, was on the ground, her face strewy with tears, her body curled in pain. Jenkins stood above her arms, crossed, radiating authority. The crowd murmured their whispers and gasps, barely contained as they waited to see what would happen next. Jenkins glanced at the officers, giving them a confident nod. He expected them to fall in line, to assume he had things under control like always. But something in their expressions told him this wasn't going to be like every other routine stop. The weight of the moment seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with GR hair, approached Jenkins first. His eyes flickered briefly to Maya before returning to Jenkins. "What's the situation here?" He asked, his voice level but cautious. Jenkins scoffed, resisting arrest. He said bluntly she was acting suspicious. Wouldn't cooperate. Typical. The officer's gaze shifted back to Maya, who was struggling to sit up now. Her breathing labored, suspicion flickered in his eyes. Something about this didn't feel right. He glanced at the crowd, at the cameras filming everything, and a knot of discomfort formed in his stomach. He had seen situations like this before, too many times. In fact, he knew when a fellow officer was hiding behind protocol to justify something darker. But this time, the public was watching. Every move they made was being documented. And if there was one thing the department couldn't afford right now, it was another scandal. Not with the way tensions were already running high between the community and law enforcement. The second officer, a younger man with a tense expression, approached Jenkins as well. His eyes darted nervously between Jenkins and Maya. He wasn't as experienced as the others, but he could sense something was off. The discomfort was evident in the way his hand hovered near his belt, as though unsure whether to rest it on his gun or keep it at his side. Maya, the younger officer, said gently, addressing her directly for the first time, "Are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" Maya looked up, startled by the question. It was the first bit of humanity she had been shown since Jenkins had yanked her from her car. Her voice shook as she tried to answer. "I'm pregnant," she stammered, one hand still cradling her belly. "Please, I just need help. I haven't done anything wrong." The crowd murmured louder now, voices rising with frustration and concern. Several people shouted in agreement, calling out that they had seen everything that Maya had done. Nothing to deserve this. The older officer turned back to Jenkins, his expression hardening slightly. "You said resisting arrest." He repeated, his tone more skeptical now. "But she's pregnant. What exactly was the threat here?" Jenkins bristled at the question. This wasn't going the way he expected. He had anticipated quick, unquestioning backup from his colleagues. Not interrogation. His grip on his belt tightened as he squared his shoulders. "Look," he said, his voice sharp. "She was acting suspicious, wouldn't comply. I don't need to explain myself. You know how it is." The older officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes scanning the scene again. The crowd, the cameras, Maya on the ground, Jenkins standing over her with barely contained aggression. Something didn't add up. The younger officer, still watching Maya with concern, moved closer to her. "Ma'am," he said softly, "can you tell us what happened? Why did this escalate?" Before Maeve could answer, Jenkins snapped, "Hey, I've got this under control. Don't undermine me." The younger officer hesitated, caught between following Jenkins' lead and his own sense of decency. But the tension in the air, the crowd watching, and the image of Maya on the ground all weighed heavily on him. He couldn't ignore it. The crowd, emboldened by the hesitation they saw in the backup officers, started speaking louder, now pointing their phones more directly at Jenkins. "She didn't do anything," someone shouted from the crowd. "She's pregnant, and you're attacking her for no reason," another voice called out. One man in the crowd stepped forward slightly, his phone trained on the scene. "This is all being recorded," he said firmly. "We saw what happened. We've got proof." Jenkins' face twisted into a snarl, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He glared at the crowd, his frustration growing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be in control here. The authority, but now with the backup officers, was hesitating, and the crowd against him, the power dynamic, was shifting. The older officer, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was taking, turned back to Jenkins. "You need to de-escalate this," he said quietly but firmly. "We're not looking for a situation here." Jenkins' jaw clenched, his pride wounded, but before he could respond, the sound of tires screeching broke through the chaos. Everyone turned as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the scene. It tinted windows obscuring whoever was inside. The crowd went silent, sensing that something big was about to happen. Jenkins frowned, squinting at the vehicle. He wasn't expecting anyone else to show up. Who the hell was this? The door to the SUV swung open, and out stepped a tall, imposing black man in a crisp suit. His presence commanded immediate attention. There was something about the way he carried himself, something about the air of authority around him that silenced even the most vocal members of the crowd. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she saw him. Relief washed over her face, even as tears continued to strain down her cheeks. Her father had arrived. Jenkins' face fell as he finally recognized who the man was. Chief Wilson, head of the city's police department. Maya's father, Jenkins' confidence wavered, the realization hitting him hard and fast. He had no idea who he had just assaulted. Chief Wilson strode purposefully toward the scene, his face a mask of cold, controlled anger. He didn't acknowledge the crowd or the officers. His focus was singular on his daughter still on the ground and on the man standing over her. The backup officers immediately stepped aside, instinctively recognizing the shift in power. Jenkins, however, stood frozen, his mind racing to catch up with the gravity of the situation. He had just attacked the police chief's daughter, and there were cameras everywhere. Chief Wilson knelt beside Maya, gently helping her to her feet. His voice was soft and tender as he spoke to her, checking to make sure she was okay. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. "Is the baby all right?" Maya nodded through her tears, relief flooding her now that her father was here. "I'm okay, Dad," she whispered. "But he attacked me." Chief Wilson's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening at her words. He stood up slowly, turning to face Jenkins, his expression hard as steel. The crowd held its breath, the tension almost unbearable. They knew Jenkins was about to face the consequences of his actions. Jenkins tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He stammered, scrambling for an explanation, but nothing he said would matter now. Chief Wilson stepped closer, his voice low and filled with barely contained fury. "Explain yourself, Officer Jenkins." A black SUV roared up to the scene, its engine low and menacing against the tense silence that had gripped the growing crowd. Maya, still hunched in pain on the ground, tried to steady her breathing, her hands shaking as they clutched her swollen stomach. Her heart raced as the door to the sleek vehicle opened, the glint of the late afternoon sun bouncing off the polished metal. A tall, imposing black man stepped out, his presence immediately drawing attention from everyone around him. He was dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a cold fire that seemed to freeze time for a brief moment. Maya's breath hitched in her throat. Her father had arrived. Officer Jenkins, the white cop who had been roughing up Maya just moments earlier, still hovered nearby, his posture rigid with self-assured authority. His hand rested near his holster, the threat of his power lingering. He wasn't expecting anyone significant to arrive, especially not someone with the kind of power that was about to shake his world. The crowd, which had grown steadily, murmured as the man stepped forward. Some already recognized him from local news, others from his commanding presence at press conferences about the city's safety. This wasn't just anyone, it was Chief Wilson, the city's police chief. Maya's father, the first 10 seconds of realization, shifted the atmosphere immediately, but Jenkins hadn't yet fully grasped who he was dealing with. Instead, he continued to walk in slow, measured steps toward Maya, glancing around at the other officers who had just arrived, their cars flanking the scene. Like silent witnesses in Jenkins' mind, more backup meant more control for him, more enforcement of his version of events. But as he glanced at his colleagues, he noticed something strange. They weren't looking at him. Jenkins frowned. The air around him seemed to tighten as his fellow officers, who had been quick to give him their attention when they first arrived, now seemed uncertain. Jenkins couldn't understand. It wasn't this a routine stop gone wrong, a black woman in a car, a simple check that escalated when she wouldn't cooperate. His eyes narrowed as he tried to make sense of their sudden hesitation. His gaze flicked toward the SUV, now towering like a black shadow over the street as Chief Wilson strode toward the scene. His expression remained calm, but his eyes were locked on one thing. His daughter. His walk was slow, deliberate. He didn't need to raise his voice or hurry. His pace power exuded from his very presence as he neared Maya, who was still on the ground, her body trembling from fear and pain. The truth, though not yet spoken aloud, was beginning to seep into the scene like a slow-moving but inevitable tidal wave. Maya's father wasn't just another concerned citizen. He was the man in charge, the man who had trained every officer here, including Jenkins, though the latter clearly had no idea who he had been roughing up on the side of the road. As Chief Wilson got closer, he crouched down, his movements gentle and protective as he assessed Maya's condition. His large hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "Maya," he said softly, his voice filled with both concern and restrained. "Fury, are you okay?" Maya nodded weakly, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. He hurt me. I didn't do anything. I swear." Wilson's jaw tightened. He had heard the fear in his daughter's voice over the phone, but seeing her in person, vulnerable and terrified, sent a surge of cold rage through him. How many times had he heard about situations like this from victims he had trained his officers to be better than this, to protect, not harm? And now here was his daughter, the person he cared for most in the world, lying on the asphalt as if she were a criminal. He stood up slowly, turning to face Jenkins. The air seemed to still as their eyes met. Jenkins's face was smug, still unaware of the depth of his mistake. "Officer Wilson," said, his voice icy and calm, "step away from her." Now Jenkins blinked, his lips curling into a dismissive smirk. "Sir, I've got this under control," he said arrogantly. "She's been resisting arrest and causing a disturbance." There was a beat of silence. Wilson's eyes darkened, and the officers standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them had already recognized their chief and were silently bracing for what was about to happen. The truth was becoming clear to everyone except Jenkins resisting arrest. Chief Wilson's voice was measured, but there was an edge to it. "Now, is that what you think happened here?" Officer Jenkins, still oblivious to the reality of the situation, nodded confidently. "That's right. He said she wasn't compliant. I gave her several warnings and she refused to follow my instructions. I had to use force to maintain control." Chief Wilson didn't break eye contact, but his posture remained calm. His calmness, though, wasn't the comforting kind. It was the kind that carried the weight of authority, the kind that made people realize they were in over their heads. Jenkins didn't recognize the warning signs, though. He was too entrenched in his own belief of how the world worked. He was the cop in charge, and Maya was just another black woman who needed to be put in her place. "Do you know who I am?" Officer Jenkins, Wilson asked quietly. Taking a single step forward, Jenkins raised an eyebrow as if the question was irrelevant. "No, sir," he said flatly, "but I don't see how that's important here." Another beat of silence. The other officers looked between Wilson and Jenkins, their faces tense. Jenkins was clearly digging himself deeper, and there was no way out. Wilson gave a small, humorless smile. "I'm Chief Wilson." He said the words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. The chief of this department, and that woman you just assaulted, she's my daughter." The revelation hit Jenkins like a punch to the gut. His smug expression vanished instantly, replaced by confusion, then fear. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization of his mistake was dawning, but it was too late. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The crowd around them, still recording, began to buzz with murmurs. Maya, lying on the ground, watched as her father stood in front of her, shielding her from the man who had attacked her just minutes before. Jenkins had no idea who he was dealing with, and now the truth had landed like a hammer. Jenkins stammered, trying to regain control of the situation, but it was too late. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice weak. "I didn't know she was your daughter, Chief. I didn't mean..." Chief Wilson cut him off with a sharp look, his eyes cold. "It doesn't matter who she is," he said firmly. "What matters is how you treated her. You used unnecessary force on a pregnant woman. You didn't care about her safety or her humanity. That's the issue, Officer Jenkins." The crowd was silent now, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Jenkins' face had gone pale, and the arrogance that had defined his every move since he had first approached Mayo was gone. His fellow officers stood back, unwilling to come to his defense. They knew they couldn't. Wilson took a deep breath, steadying himself. The rage he felt toward Jenkins was personal, but he knew it was also bigger than that. This wasn't just about his daughter. It was about every black person who had been treated this way by those sworn to protect him. He had seen this kind of injustice play out too many times, and now it had come to his doorstep. He turned to one of the nearby officers, his voice firm. "Get paramedics over here now to check on my daughter," he ordered, "and make sure she's safe." As the officers scrambled to follow his orders, Wilson turned back to Jenkins, who now looked like a man who knew his career was hanging by a thread. The truth was out, and there was no going back. "You'll answer for this," Wilson said quietly. "I'll make sure of it." As Jenkins stood frozen, the reality of his actions settling in the crowd shifted, capturing every moment on their phones. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences were only just beginning. Officer Jenkins stood frozen, his grip still tight on Maya's arm, though she was no longer resisting. His breath came in shallow bursts. The adrenaline from his overzealous arrest starting to wear off. The atmosphere around him had shifted drastically in a matter of seconds, but he couldn't yet grasp the full magnitude of what was happening. The black SUV that had just pulled up, the one that seemed to command the silent attention of everyone around it, had caught him off guard. It wasn't until the back door opened and the tall, imposing figure stepped out that Jenkins felt a strange knot begin to form in his stomach. Chief Wilson, Maya's father, the police chief himself, emerged from the vehicle with an air of quiet authority. His face unreadable, but his movements deliberate and measured. Jenkins blinked, his mind scrambling to connect the dots. Her father was the police chief. Time seemed to slow as Chief Wilson walked toward Maya, his gaze fixed solely on his daughter. He didn't acknowledge the crowd, the other officers, or even Jenkins at first. All that mattered to him in that moment was Maya. The air felt thick with tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. Maya, still on the ground, cradled her swollen belly, her face contorted in pain, and relief washed over her the moment she saw her father. But the emotional weight of what had just happened kept her glued to the spot. Tears streamed down her face, her body trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Chief Wilson crouched down beside her, his large hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Maya," he said softly, his voice calm but full of concern. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you or the baby?" Mayave could barely speak, her words coming out in broken sobs. "Dad, he grabbed me." She stammered, her voice shaky. He wouldn't listen. He said I was resisting, but I wasn't." Wilson's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he listened to his daughter's words. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know the type of Officer Jenkins was the kind who let his prejudices dictate his actions, who saw a black person, especially one standing up for themselves, as a threat without taking his eyes off Maya. Chief Wilson signaled for the paramedics to come over. "Check her," he ordered them calmly. "Make sure she and the baby are all right." The paramedics rushed over, moving quickly but carefully. Jenkins stood just a few feet away, his heart pounding in his chest. The gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in, but he still hadn't fully processed it. The police chief's daughter, the police chief's pregnant daughter. His mind flashed back to the moment when he first approached Maya's car, his tone immediately aggressive, his assumptions already made. She was black. She was driving a nice car. She must have been up to something. That was the story he had told himself, and now he realized just how wrong he had been. Jenkins' hand still hovered near his holster, a reflex he hadn't let go of yet. Even though the situation had de-escalated, he swallowed, hard sweat beginning to beat on his forehead. Did his gaze flick nervously toward the other officers who had arrived on the scene? They were watching. They knew Chief Wilson finally stood up from where he had been kneeling beside Maya. His eyes locked onto Jenkins for the first time, and in that instant, Jenkins felt like the ground beneath him might give way. The weight of the chief's gaze was like a Thorwandor LBS. Wilson took slow, deliberate steps toward him, his face still unreadable, his posture. But Jenkins could feel the storm brewing beneath the surface. The other officers who had initially arrived thinking this was just a routine backup call stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of what to do. They knew this was no longer a routine situation. Jenkins opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to try and justify what had happened, but no words came out. His mind raced, but he couldn't find a way to spin this. Not now. Not with the police chief standing in front of him, the cameras, the phones held up by the crowd, and the whispers of the onlookers were closing in around him like a noose officer. Jenkins, Chief Wilson, said, his voice low, but with a dangerous edge to it, "Step away from my daughter." Jenkins hesitated for a split second too long, his hand still twitching near his holster, and that was all Wilson needed to see the chief's eyes flick down to Jenkins' hand, and his expression hardened. "I said step away." Wilson repeated, his voice cutting through the tension. Like a knife. Jenkins finally stepped back, his hands rising in front of him as if to show he meant no harm. His pulse raced, and for the first time a sliver of fear crept into his chest. This was not how he had imagined the situation unfolding. "I didn't know," Jenkins stammered, the words falling clumsily from his mouth. "I didn't know who she was. I thought she was." "You thought she was what, Jenkins?" Chief Wilson interrupted, his voice cold and controlled. "You thought she was just another black woman you could push around. You thought she was someone you could intimidate, someone who wouldn't fight back." Jenkins blinked rapidly, the reality of his mistake sinking in deeper with every word. He had thought he was in control. He had thought his badge gave him power over anyone in front of him, but he had never considered that this time he wasn't the one with power. "I didn't mean," Jenkins began again, but the chief cut him off once more. "No, Jenkins, you didn't think that's the problem. You didn't think at all. You saw my daughter, and you assumed the worst. You assumed that because she was black, she was a threat. You assumed that you had the right to treat her any way you wanted." The other officers stood silently, none of them daring to step in. They could see where this was going, and none of them wanted to be in Jenkins' shoes right now. Chief Wilson took another step forward, his voice now low and dangerously calm. "Do you know what could have happened today?" he asked, his eyes burning into Jenkins. "Do you have any idea how close you came to hurting not just my daughter, but my grandchild?" Jenkins' mouth went dry. He could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. His training, his authority, his badge, none of it mattered now. Not when he was standing in front of the man who had more power than he could ever imagine. "I'm sorry, Chief Jenkins," said his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to get out of hand." "I didn't know she was." Chief Wilson cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You didn't need to know who she was," he snapped, his calm demeanor finally breaking for a brief moment. "You didn't need to know she was my daughter to treat her with basic human decency. That's where you failed, Jenkins. You failed as an officer, and you failed as a human being." Jenkins stood there numb as the weight of the chief's words hung in the air. He had no defense, no explanation that could undo what he had done. His authority had crumbled in an instant, and now he was left standing in the wreckage of his own actions. Chief Wilson stepped back, his anger now firmly under control. Again he looked to the other officers who had been watching the scene unfold. "Arrest him," the chief said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officers hesitated for only a second before moving forward to comply. Jenkins' eyes widened in shock as he felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around his wrists as the other officers led Jenkins away. Chief Wilson turned back to Maya, who was now being checked over by the paramedics. Relief washed over him as he saw that she and the baby were okay, but the anger, the frustration, the deep sense of betrayal lingered. Maya watched her father, her eyes still filled with tears, but also gratitude. She knew what could have happened. If he hadn't arrived in time, she knew how differently this story could have ended. And as she watched Jenkins being led away, she knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. Chief Wilson stood tall, his face emaced of restrained fury as he approached Officer Jenkins. The moment felt surreal. Only minutes ago, Jenkins had been in complete control, barking orders and using force against Mayo, without hesitation. Now the air was thick with tension, and every single pair of eyes was locked on the two men, the aggressor and the father of the victim. The first few seconds of silence between them were deafening. Jenkins had backed away slightly, trying to maintain a sense of authority, but it was slipping fast. His uniform, once a symbol of his power, felt like a heavyweight. Now, as the reality of his situation began to sink in, this was no ordinary encounter. The man standing before him wasn't just a concerned father. He was the chief of police, and every single officer on the scene knew it. Chief Wilson's eyes were dark with controlled anger. His jaw clenched. He hadn't said a word yet, but his presence alone made it clear that Jenkins was in deep trouble. Maya, still sitting on the ground, watched the scene unfold through the blur of tears. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, phones raised, capturing every second of this unfolding drama. The silence was electric, waiting for the storm to break. Finally, Chief Wilson spoke, his voice calm, but laced with an authority that bred no argument. "What happened here, Officer Jenkins?" His tone was deceptively measured, but the danger beneath it was unmistakable. Jenkins, for the first time, faltered. His hand instinctively went to his belt, as though seeking some reassurance from his badge. His gun, anything to remind him of his position, but the weight of the badge felt hollow, now meaningless, in the face of what was happening. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had expected backup solidarity from his fellow officers. Instead, they stood behind Chief Wilson, silent, unwilling to meet his gaze. Jenkins swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "She was resisting arrest, sir. I was following procedure." His words sounded weak even to him. The excuses he had so often relied on felt flimsy, like a crumbling defense in front of a man who knew the system better than anyone else. Chief Wilson took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Procedure?" His voice was low, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You're telling me that dragging a pregnant woman to the ground was procedure?" Jenkins felt a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he justify this? He had acted on impulse, driven by the same ingrained prejudice that he had never questioned before. To him, Maya had been another black suspect, another person to control, not a human being with a life of her own. "I asked you a question." Chief Wilson said, his voice now sharper. "Why did you escalate this situation? Why did you use force against a pregnant woman?" Jenkins floundered, glancing around for support from his fellow officers, but no one came to his defense. They stood like statues, unwilling to intervene, knowing that siding with Jenkins now would be career suicide. This wasn't just another routine incident. It was a monumental mayep, one that had happened in broad daylight in front of a growing crowd, with camera phones recording every second of it. I didn't know she was pregnant." Jenkins stammered, the words tumbling out clumsily. "She wasn't complying, and I wasn't complying." Chief Wilson interrupted, his voice rising slightly, the cold fury in his eyes was unmistakable now. What part of her actions indicated she was a threat, officer? Jenkins, was it the fact that she had her hands up? Was it the fact that she told you repeatedly that she was pregnant? Jenkins opened his mouth, then closed it again. His excuses felt pathetic, flimsy threads that he knew wouldn't hold up under the weight of Chief Wilson's interrogation. The officer's mind raced desperately, trying to come up with something, anything that would justify his actions. But there was nothing. Chief Wilson's expression hardened. He stepped closer, his towering figure casting a long shadow over Jenkins. "Let me be clear about something," Wilson said, his voice low, but filled with barely controlled anger. "I don't care who you are, what you think you saw, or what your prejudices tell you. You attacked my daughter, my pregnant daughter, and you did it because you thought you could get away with it, because she's black." Jenkins flinched at the words, the harsh truth of them sinking in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a situation that could be explained away with the usual excuses of feeling threatened or suspecting danger. He had acted out of raw prejudice, and now it was coming back to haunt him in the worst possible way. "I swear, Chief, I didn't know." Jenkins tried again, but Wilson cut him off, his voice like a blade. "Didn't know what, Officer Jenkins?" Wilson asked, stepping closer. "That she was my daughter, or that your bias, your racism was showing?" The crowd murmured, the tension rising with every word. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when the powerful man standing in front of them would demand accountability, not just as a father, but as the leader of the police force, a force that was now on the verge of being torn apart by one officer's actions. Jenkins' mouth was dry, his thoughts spinning in every direction, his usual confidence. The authority that came with his uniform had evaporated under Chief Wilson's piercing gaze. He had never imagined that this would be the outcome. When he had stopped Maya on the side of the road, in his mind she had been just another target, another body to control. He had underestimated her, and worse, he had underestimated her father. Chief Wilson straightened his voice. Cal once again, but filled with the weight of finality. You had no reason to escalate this situation. Jenkins, no reason to lay a hand on my daughter, and no reason to treat the way you did, except for the fact that you saw her skin color and assumed you could do whatever you wanted. Jenkins felt the sting of those words deep in his chest. The silence between them was unbearable now, stretching longer than it should have, every second heavier than the last. I didn't mean for this to happen, Sir Jenkins said weakly. But even he didn't believe it. The excuses that had worked so many times before, reasons like I felt threatened or she wasn't complying, meant nothing. Now the world around him was changing, and it had caught up with him faster than he could have anticipated. Chief Wilson's eyes narrowed. You didn't mean for this to happen, he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. What exactly did you mean to happen? Officer, did you expect my daughter to cower in fear to submit because you told her to? Did you expect no one to be watching? No cameras, no crowd? Or did you expect the system to protect you the way it always has? Jenkins' heart pounded in his chest. Every word felt like a punch to the gut. He had always believed that the system would back him up, that his actions would be justified as long as he could explain them away. But this time was different. This time he wasn't dealing with an ordinary citizen. He was dealing with the police chief's daughter. Chief Wilson's expression was unreadable, but there was a cold resolve in his eyes. Here's what's going to happen, Jenkins, he said quietly, his voice steady. You're going to face the consequences of your actions just like anyone else would. And I'm going to make sure that justice is served not just for my daughter, but for every person you've treated this way. Jenkins felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This was it. The end of the line. There was no coming back from this. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Chief Wilson stepped back, turning his attention to the officer standing nearby. Place Officer Jenkins under arrest. Wilson ordered, his voice firm, for assault. The officers, who had been frozen in place, sprang into action. They moved quickly, placing Jenkins in handcuffs as the crowd began to stir. The balance of power had shifted completely, and Jenkins knew it. He was no longer the one in control. He was the one being dragged away, facing the consequences of his actions. For the first time in his career, as Jenkins was led away, the crowd began to cheer, their voices rising in a wave of triumph. Phones recorded every second, capturing the moment for the world to see. Justice had been served, at least for now, but for Maya and for Chief Wilson, the scars of what had happened would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling. Maya, still shaken, but now surrounded by paramedics, watched this. Her father stood tall, his face hard, but resolute. She knew that the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but in this moment at least she felt a glimmer of hope. Her father had done what so many others had failed to do. He had stood up for her. The air was thick with tension as Mild leaned against the side of the ambulance. The paramedics gently checking her pulse. She felt the cool air on her skin, but her heart still raced from the adrenaline, the fear, and the disbelief at what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to her. Not to the daughter of Chief Wilson, the man who commanded respect and authority in every corner of the city. But even now, as she sat there, she knew that none of that mattered to Officer Jenkins. When he first saw her across the scene, a crowd had gathered, most holding up their phones, recording the unfolding drama that had turned from a routine traffic stop into a viral spectacle. The world was watching, and the murmurs of disbelief and anger grew louder as the crowd realized who her father was, but also that his position wasn't enough to stop the racist assumptions. Jenkins made the racist attack Jenkins committed was now on full display, and there was no turning back. Officer Jenkins stood stiffly, his eyes darting between Chief Wilson and the other officers who were now waiting for orders. The confidence Jenkins had displayed earlier had completely vanished, his face pale, as the weight of what he'd done began to sink in. He wasn't just facing a complaint, now he was facing his superior's wrath. Chief Wilson stood a few feet away from Jenkins, his expression unreadable, but his presence commanding every step he took toward Jenkins was deliberate, slow, like a predator sizing up his prey. Ma's father was a man who rarely raised his voice, but when he did, people listened, and today he didn't need to shout. His cold, steady stares said everything. The crowd fell silent as Chief Wilson stopped directly in front of Jenkins, towering over him. For a long, tense moment, the chief didn't say anything. He just stood there looking at the man who had dared to lay hands on his daughter. The silence was suffocating. Everyone waited for the chief to speak, but no one could predict what he would do next. "You're going to tell me?" Chief Wilson began, his voice low but firm. "Why you thought it was acceptable to put your hands on a pregnant woman, and more importantly, why you thought it was acceptable to put your hands on my daughter?" The words hit Jenkins like a physical blow. He stammered, his mouth opening and closing, but no coherent explanation came out. His mind raced. How could he explain away what he had done? There was no justification, and now with the entire city watching, there was no escape, sir. I didn't know who she was." Jenkins stuttered desperately, trying to recover. He raised his hands in a defensive gesture, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't know she was your daughter." Chief Wilson cut him off with a sharp look. "It shouldn't matter who she is," he said coldly. "What matters is that she's a human being, a woman, and you treated her like she was a criminal simply because of the color of her skin." Jenkins opened his mouth again, but no words came out. The reality of the situation was setting in. There was no excuse, no justification that could save him. He had let his racism dictate his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. Consequences far more severe than he had imagined. "I've known about you." Jenkins' Chief Wilson continued, his voice unwavering. "I've heard the complaints, the reports of your behavior, but I let it slide. I thought it could be fixed with training, with oversight, but clearly I was wrong." Jenkins swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him, judging him. He was no longer in control. For the first time, he realized just how deeply he had misjudged everything. Chief Wilson gestured to the other officers, his expression darkening. "Cuff him," he ordered. The officers hesitated for a moment, glancing at one another. Jenkins had been one of their own, but now the power dynamics had shifted, and they knew there was no avoiding what needed to happen. The officers slowly moved toward Jenkins, pulling out handcuffs. Jenkins flinched, stepping back instinctively. "Wait, you can't do this," he protested, his voice rising in desperation. "I was doing my job, your job." Chief Wilson's voice was icy. "Your job was to protect and serve, not to attack innocent people, not to harass women, not to act on the worst kind of hate." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger palpable. Jenkins could feel the pressure building around him. The walls closing, in his career was over, his reputation destroyed, all because he couldn't see past his own prejudices. As the officers closed in, Jenkins tried one last desperate plea. "Didn't mean it like that. I thought she was resisting arrest." Chief Wilson shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "Stop talking," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge passing sentence. "Anything you say from here on out will only make things worse for you." The handcuffs clicked into place around Jenkins' wrists. The once confident officer, who had so easily used his power against others, was now powerless. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a mixture of relief and justice. They had seen too many moments like this, moments where Black people were targeted and brutalized by those in authority, but this time there was justice. This time the tables had turned. Maya watched the scene unfold from the back of the ambulance, her hands resting protectively on her belly. She felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, fear, anger. She had always known that her father's position gave her a certain level of protection, but even that hadn't stopped Jenkins from attacking her in the eyes of people like Jenkins. Her blackness outweighed her humanity as Jenkins was led toward a waiting police car. His face ashen, Chief Wilson turned and walked back toward Maya. His stern expression softened as he approached her, kneeling beside her and taking her hand. His voice, once cold and authoritative, was now filled with fatherly concern. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently, his eyes searching her face for any sign of distress. Maya nodded, but her voice trembled slightly. "I'm okay now," she whispered. I couldn't believe it was happening. I thought." She broke off, her throat tight with emotion. "I thought he was going to hurt me. Dad really hurt me." Chief Wilson's face hardened again, but this time with a father's protective instinct. Don't let anyone hurt you. He promised, not while I'm here." "Not ever." Maya squeezed his hand, grateful for his strength, but she couldn't shake the lingering fears that gripped her. Jenkins wasn't an anomaly. He was part of a system that had targeted people like her for generations, even with her father's power. She knew this wasn't the last time she'd face this kind of hatred. As the police car drove away with Jenkins in the back seat, the crowd began to disperse, the event recorded on countless phones, ready to be shared with the world. This was more than just an incident. It was a symbol of something greater. Maya watched the car disappear down the road, her hands still resting on her belly. She knew she would be okay, but the scars of this day would remain with her for a long time. She glanced at her father, who was still standing protectively by her side, and felt a wave of gratitude. But she also felt something deeper, a resolve to fight back against the system that allowed men like Jenkins to exist. As the sun began to set over the city, casting long shadows on the street, Maya knew that this moment, captured on video for the world to see, would spark conversations, protests, and maybe even change. But she also knew that the fight was far from over for now. There was justice, but tomorrow the struggle for equality would continue.